Hello, class. This lecture is titled The Eastern Parallel, the Confucian Answer to the Socratic Tradition. And as the title implies, this lecture is all about Confucianism. I'll give you a moment to look at the key terms list. All right, let's get started. I guess the first question that we need to answer um, in this lecture is who was Confucius? Most experts agree that the historical Confucius, who lived probably between the years 551 and 479 BCE, was born in the state of Lu on the northeastern coast of China, probably, as I said, in the year 551 BCE, which places his life during the latter stages of the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou dynasty lasted for about 800 years, from 1046 to 256 BCE. The Zhou state, which at its highest point dominated much of what is now northeastern China, had replaced the Shang dynasty, China's second of three pre-unification dynasties, after defeating the last Shang king's army at the Battle of Muye in 1046 BCE, in which most of the Shang king's army defected to the Zhou side. By Confucius's time, however, the Zhou dynasty's greatest years were behind it, and about 70 years after his death, the unity that it had brought to much of China would collapse in an era of internecine violence called the Warring States period, which lasts for about 200 years, from 403 to 221 BCE, during which the Zhou Empire would unravel and numerous smaller states would end up jockeying for power with one another, creating a lot of violence and confusion and turmoil. Confucius was born into an aristocratic family of the Shi class. That term is often translated as knight or retainer. Families of the Shi class were originally landowners, but by Confucius's time, most of them had lost their land and made a living as officials slash civil servants for various regional rulers or lords. Confucius himself seems to have held a number of mid-level bureaucratic offices in the Lu state, including director of corrections, and at one point an accountant at a granary. While serving the Lu ruler, he had access to the ruler's library, where he spent many years in quiet study, compiling and editing what would eventually come to be regarded as the five classic texts of Confucianism. These included the Book of Changes, which was part of an emerging literature on fortune telling. It was basically a manual to fortune tellers on how to perform various soothsaying rituals. The Book of History, which is a collection of historical documents justifying the overthrow of the Shang dynasty and the creation of the Zhou state. It's the first lengthy historical narrative in Chinese history. It's also where the concept of the mandate of heaven comes from. We talked about that earlier this semester. The Book of Etiquette, which is basically a behavior manual, especially for members of the noble class, dictating proper behavior at social events and how to perform certain ceremonial rites during the Zhou dynasty, like funerals, feasts, archery competitions, etc. The Book of Songs, which is a collection of Chinese songs and poems allegedly compiled by Confucius, which explore such timeless themes as love, courtship, farming, and the hardships of war. And then the last of the five classics is the Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle of the later history of the Zhou dynasty from the late 8th century BCE to Confucius's time. I would point out Confucius did not write any of these five classics. He merely compiled and edited them. Confucius eventually left the service of the Lu ruler. Some accounts suggest after a quarrel over the ruler's womanizing lifestyle, which Confucius regarded as being unbecoming of a lord. And he spent several years of his life wandering about China, teaching and gathering disciples, and so on. Like his Western counterpart and near contemporary Socrates, who was born about a decade after Confucius's death, Confucius left behind no original writings of his own. He is, as I mentioned, usually regarded as the editor and compiler of the five aforementioned classics of the Confucius tradition. But he didn't write anything of his own. But Confucius's numerous students and disciples did compile many of his sayings and anecdotes about his life into a book typically referred to as the Analects, also sometimes called the Analects of Confucius, which most scholars regard as being a fairly accurate record of Confucius's thought and teachings. So what were those teachings? Well, let's move on to the next slide to talk about that. In the Analects, Confucius describes himself to his disciples as a mere transmitter who merely imparted wisdom that he had curated, that he had gathered and collected from ancient texts like the aforementioned five classics, and then imparted that wisdom to his students. Those students, however, clearly believed that their teacher, sometimes referred to as Master Kong, had something important to say, which is why they gathered his sayings into the Analects in the first place. Unlike Socrates, who developed a system of philosophical inquiry, the Socratic method, designed to uncover objective truths about the world, Confucianism is fundamentally a practical philosophy designed to teach human beings how to live lives of integrity and propriety, as well as, to some extent, a political philosophy outlining the proper duties between ruler and subject, as well as the desirable qualities that rulers should seek to cultivate in themselves. Much of Confucius's ethical teachings focused on the importance of cultivating in oneself certain virtues that would allow a person to live a life of integrity, honor, and propriety towards others. In the Analects, Confucius refers to such a life as the, quote, way or Tao of the gentleman, the way of the gentleman. The term for gentleman is junzi, by the way. And it's also sometimes defined as an ideal or superior person. So basically, the goal of Confucian philosophy is to teach his followers how to live the life of an ideal or superior human being. And this meant cultivating five virtues that Confucius deemed to be essential to following the way of the gentleman. The first is benevolence, or ren. The basic idea here is that one should always act towards others with consideration of what is in their best interests. One of the more famous sayings of Confucius from the Analects is, "What you do not wish done to yourself, do not do to others," often described as the Confucian golden rule. This did not mean, however, that one should merely do what others wish in order to win their favor, but that one should do what is truly in their best interest, which would help them cultivate benevolence or ren in themselves. Or as Confucius put it, the man of noble mind seeks to perfect the good in others and not their evil. The small-minded man seeks the reverse of this. So in other words, basically, do to others whatever will help them live their best life and become their best selves. Don't just do whatever makes them happy and wins their favor. The second virtue, righteousness, or yi. The second virtue is righteousness, or yi, and it roughly equates to unselfishness or integrity, especially in one's dealings with others, or in the case of a public official, in the discharge of one's duty. As Confucius put it, a gentleman thinks of righteousness when faced with gain. Confucius's disciples were known to celebrate their master as exemplifying this virtue in his own conduct, pointing out that even though he held several important positions in the Lu state, he himself remained very poor most of his life, which of course meant that he was not taking advantage of his position, as so many of his contemporaries were known to do. The third virtue is ritual propriety, or li, also sometimes defined as proper conduct. And this virtue refers to a person being willing to play his or her role in society well, particularly with an eye towards fulfilling one's traditional obligations in certain customary relationships that most people could expect to participate in during their lives. In particular, Confucius identified 5 constant relationships. He's called them 5 constant relationships that most people, would be involved in at some point in their lives, and that they should really emphasize performing well in order to be a better person. Those would be the relationships between ruler and subject, the relationships between parent and child, the relationship between husband and wife, the relationship between elder brother and younger brother, and the relationship between elder friend and younger friend. Now, according to Confucius, although each of these relationships entailed a certain hierarchy, in other words, in each of these relationships, one person clearly held more authority or power than the other, they also entailed certain reciprocal obligations. In other words, all of the parties to these relationships owed something to the other. Husbands, for example, were obligated to protect their wives and work hard to provide for them, while wives were obligated to honor and obey their husbands and, if possible, bear them children. Likewise, parents were obligated to provide and care for their children, to raise them, educate them, etc., while children were obligated to obey their parents when they were young, also care for them when they were old, and mourn for them when they died. Confucius, for example, mourned for his mother for 3 years after her passing, an example which many of his disciples strove to follow. And Confucius also teaches the importance of making sacrifices in their memory after their death, and even after the mourning period has expired, which is part of a Chinese tradition of ancestor veneration that remains an important component of Chinese culture even to this day. It should also be noted that, according to Confucius, family relationships should be governed by an underlying value called filial piety, or zhao. For Confucius, possessing zhao meant honoring and reverencing one's family and working hard to fulfill one's obligations towards family members, including caring for children and elders, helping out siblings whenever possible, and also having children yourself to continue the family line. All of that was part of the duty that you owed to your family. Now, a corollary to the Confucian emphasis on ritual propriety is also a belief in the importance of ritual itself and/or tradition. Confucius taught that most of these constant relationships could be performed well if one deliberately followed the rites, rituals, and traditions of one's society. Or, as Confucius put it, do not look or listen, speak or move unless it is in accordance with the rites. In other words, do nothing that isn't in accordance with tradition. Um, it's important to note, however, that Confucianism does not advocate ritual for its own sake in order to be meaningful. Ritual has to be accompanied by the right attitude or state of mind. Or as Confucius put it, ritual performed without reverence or mourning without grief, these are things that I cannot bear to see. So in other words, it's not enough just to do the right thing, just to observe the right rituals or traditions. You also have to mean it. The fourth virtue, wisdom, or ji, involves cultivating the ability to correctly appraise both people, situations, and oneself. To Confucius, wisdom meant being able to discern both upright and crooked character traits in others and to act accordingly, as well as to correctly appraise one's own character and abilities and work to improve oneself. One way to do this was to trust and promote those people who exhibited upright character while being wary of those who exhibited the opposite traits. At the same time, Confucius also cautioned that wisdom should be tempered in two ways. First, with kindness, for, as he put it, how can a person be considered wise if that person does not dwell in benevolence? And second, with humility. He told one disciple that true knowledge meant being confident in the things you know, but also being willing to admit the things you don't know. Admit the things, admit where the limits of your knowledge and understanding lie. The final virtue, trustworthiness, or jin, is kind of a combination of honesty and reliability. According to Confucius, if one is trustworthy, others will give one responsibilities. So in other words, if you want to advance in your career or win the trust of others, it's important to say what you mean and also do what you say. And while it's important to be trustworthy, it's also important that others know this about you. In other words, it's important for you to cultivate the reputation of being trustworthy, although Confucius did emphasize that that impression needs to be based on reality, not merely reputation. The value of trustworthiness is a good place to pivot to talking about politics, because while all of the aforementioned virtues were important for rulers and public officials, trustworthiness, or jin, was by far the most important for that group of people. According to one story in the Analects, Confucius was once asked what three things a kingdom needed most. And he replied, arms or weapons, food, and trust. When asked which of these things a kingdom could most afford to lose, he said arms. When asked what it could afford to dispense with next, he said food. The one thing a kingdom could not afford to lose, however, was the trust of the people in their rulers. For if the people do not find the ruler trustworthy, the state will not stand. In order to win the people's trust, however, it was also important for a ruler to show wisdom, or ji, particularly in promoting good and honest officials to positions of importance within the state. As Confucius put it, place the upright over the crooked, and the crooked will be straightened out. And one of the most important virtues to look for in an official was righteousness, or yi, particularly when it came to discharging one's duty without regard for personal gain or promotion. According to Confucius, the man of honor thinks of his character, the inferior man of his position. The man of honor desires justice, the inferior man favor. Finally, perhaps the most important thing for both rulers and officials to do was to set a good example for their subjects to follow. Confucius had a strong belief in the power of rulers to alter their subjects' behavior simply by setting a good example to follow. Or as he put it, if a ruler is himself upright, his people will do their duty without orders. But if he himself is not upright, Although he may order, they will not obey. Now, as I mentioned above, Confucius himself left behind no original works of his own, only compilations that he is said to have curated and edited, namely the five classics, and also collections of his sayings and teachings recorded by his many disciples, i.e. the Analects. Indeed, like Socrates, without Confucius's disciples and the many scholars who have studied his teachings after his death, we would know nothing about him. One of Confucius's greatest posthumous disciples, kind of like his Plato, a guy who lived roughly 100 years after his death, was the Chinese philosopher Mencius. Mencius is kind of like the Plato to Confucius's Socrates. Mencius took the Confucian traditions, what Confucius, is said to have taught his many disciples through the Analects, and he elaborated and expounded upon them, addressing many issues that Confucius himself either did not cover or barely covered. So, for example, Mencius had a lot to say about human nature, a topic that Confucius did not explicitly address. Mencius taught that human nature was innately good, but that it could be corrupted without positive, cultivating influence from one's society. To Mencius, the way to cultivate the best in human nature was through education or the training of one's mind. Or as he put it, he who exerts his mind to the utmost knows his nature. Finally, the Confucian tradition really took root in China. Last thing I want you to know about the Confucian tradition is that it really took root in China during the Han Dynasty, which starts around 202 BCE and lasts to about 220 CE. The Han rulers really liked Confucianism because of its emphasis on uprightness and integrity among government officials, and also because of its emphasis on obedience on the part of subjects. And for that reason, they made it the official state philosophy, as well as the basis of their entire educational system. And ever since then, Confucianism has remained a deeply ingrained part of Chinese culture. The end.